Hey guys, tonight we walk out onto a high sandy plateau where the air still holds the day's warmth and a vast stone face waits in the dark, like it has been listening for a very long time. You can almost feel the grit under your shoes, hear the faint hiss of wind moving across limestone, and see the Great Sphinx resting with that familiar, battered calm that may look eternal, even though historians debate nearly every detail around it. Some parts of tonight's story are widely accepted history, some parts are interpretation, and some parts are calm. What if imagination? We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. The monument might be exactly what many scholars think it is, or it could preserve clues that suggest a longer, stranger timeline. And yes, if you showed up here in sandals, no water, and pure confidence, you probably won't survive this as a serious fieldwork strategy, but your optimism would be noted. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're awake with me tonight, post your location and local time in the comments. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You stand at Giza in your imagination, not as a conquering hero or a documentary narrator with dramatic drone footage, but as a sleepy visitor trying to make sense of stone silence and time. The pyramid silhouettes sit nearby, severe and geometric, while the Sphinx feels different at once. It is shaped like intention and erosion at the same time, like a monument and a survivor. Most historians agree that the Great Sphinx of Giza belongs to ancient Egypt and is usually placed in the Old Kingdom, often associated with the era of Pharaoh Khafra. That is the solid ground to begin on, and it matters. Archaeology suggests the Sphinx is part of the larger Giza complex, not some random statue dropped from the sky by mysterious contractors with a cosmic invoice. The body and enclosure are carved from the natural limestone bedrock of the plateau, and the surrounding temples fit into a broad royal and ceremonial landscape. What's broadly accepted is that this was a place of power labour, ritual engineering and royal messaging on a scale that still makes modern people squint and say, okay, but how many workers was that? And yet the Sphinx invites a different kind of question than the pyramids do. The pyramids often provoke admiration for precision. The Sphinx provokes suspicion, curiosity, and occasionally the kind of confidence usually found in late-night comment sections. The face is damaged, the nose is missing, the headdress is worn, the body stretches long and low, and the stone surface bears marks that people interpret in different ways. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. So tonight you begin with a gentle what if. What if the story is pointing at something else, not a secret truth revealed in one dramatic sentence, not a hidden civilization declared with absolute certainty, but a puzzle, a debated interpretation, a possibility. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. As your eyes adjust in this mental night walk, the plateau seems to breathe in layers. You know the name Sphinx, but even that name comes later through Greek comparison to their own mythical Sphinx. The ancient Egyptians had their own names and meanings for lion-bodied guardian figures, and the monument's role changed across time. Most historians agree that later Egyptian rulers, especially in the New Kingdom, restored and revered the Sphinx, which means even for them it was already old. That part is documented and important. It does not automatically make it millennia older than dynastic Egypt. Let me rephrase that more carefully. It shows the monument had a long life and a long memory inside Egyptian civilization, but it does not by itself settle the debate about when it was first carved. This is where the mind starts doing what the mind does best at night, connecting weathered lines, missing records, and giant stone paws into a story that may be bigger than the usual timeline. One interpretation is that the Sphinx's unusual wear and the way it sits in the landscape encourage questions about whether it could preserve traces of a deeper past. That's a possibility, not a certainty. A more cautious explanation could be that ancient monuments often look older than they are because they have been exposed, repaired, buried, uncovered, and argued over for centuries. If you've ever left a garden statue outside for one rainy season and watched it age emotionally, you already understand the principle. Still, the imagination lingers because the Giza Plateau is one of those places where documented history and human wonder keep bumping into each other like sleepy travellers in a dark hallway. You can picture torchlight from different centuries moving across the same face. Priests, workers, pilgrims, soldiers, tourists, scholars, people with notebooks, people with theories and no notebooks, which is always a thrilling category. Historians still argue whether the Sphinx's current form and surface marks can tell us more about its earliest phase than traditional dating methods alone can reveal. There's no full consensus on every detail, especially when debates spill beyond mainstream Egyptology into geology, climate history, and alternative interpretations. Most historians agree on the broad dynastic context, yes, but scholars continue to debate specific questions about carving phases, restoration episodes, and how much of what you see today belongs to the beginning versus later repair. That distinction matters tonight because your question is not simply how old is the Sphinx, but what if it is millennia older than Egypt itself? And right away you have to slow down and define the terms because Egypt itself can mean several things. Do you mean dynastic pharaonic Egypt with kings' hieroglyphs and royal monuments of the Old Kingdom? Do you mean earlier Nile communities before unification? Do you mean the land and cultures that existed long before the first pharaoh wore a double crown? The evidence we do have points to a Nile region full of human life, long before dynastic Egypt emerged, so the phrase can become slippery fast. That slipperiness is not a problem, it is part of the mood. It's possible that the strongest version of the older than Egypt idea is less about replacing known history and more about asking whether some sacred places preserve deeper layers than the dynasties that later monumentalized them. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the question becomes more interesting and less shouty. You do not have to choose between nothing unusual here and everything is a conspiracy. Sleep-friendly history is a middle path. You sit with the clues. You keep the solid ground separate from the mist. And the first clue really is emotional before it is technical. The Sphinx feels old in a way that even other ancient things sometimes do not. That feeling is not proof. This is suggestive, not conclusive. But it helps explain why the monument keeps attracting theories. A fringe idea proposes that the Sphinx predates dynastic Egypt by many thousands of years, perhaps reaching back into a wetter prehistoric age. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it persists because it attaches itself to visible features people can point at, especially erosion patterns and geological questions that we'll examine carefully later. For now, you just stand there in the mind's eye, with the wind brushing past your ears, the limestone holding heat below your feet, and that giant face watching in patient silence. Most historians agree that the Sphinx belongs within ancient Egyptian civilization. One interpretation is that later generations may have inherited, restored or reimagined parts of what came before, and in the calm cinematic space between those two ideas, you allow the first what if to settle in without forcing it to become a fact. We're not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. The wind keeps moving across the plateau, and once you let your eyes stay on the stone long enough, the question shifts from the Sphinx alone to the land around it, because monuments do not rise in isolation any more than bedtime thoughts do. They belong to roads, quarries, workers' camps, temples, rituals, kings and habits of the living. What's broadly accepted is that the Giza Plateau became one of the most important royal landscapes of Egypt's Old Kingdom, especially during the 4th dynasty, when pyramid building reached a kind of architectural confidence that still feels slightly unreasonable in the best way. Most historians agree that the Great Pyramids of Khufu Khafre and Menkaure were built in the 3rd millennium BCE as part of a royal funerary and ceremonial program tied to kingship, cosmic order, and the afterlife. Archaeology suggests this was not chaos with ropes. It was organised labour planning, quarry logistics administration, and technical skill. The evidence we do have points to a highly capable society that could move stone at scale, align monuments with remarkable precision, and sustain large state projects over years. In other words, ancient Egypt was not mysterious because people lacked intelligence. It is mysterious because they had plenty of it, and they used it on a level that still makes your modern to-do list look like a sticky note. As you drift across the plateau in your imagination, the accepted timeline begins to arrange itself around you. To one side are cemeteries and mastabas for elites. Nearby are causeways and temples linked to pyramid complexes. There are traces of settlement and labour infrastructure that suggest a functioning ecosystem of builders, priests, officials, and support workers. Giza in mainstream history is a planned sacred royal landscape. That is the anchor. It matters because any theory about the Sphinx has to fit challenge or somehow explain this larger context. And this is exactly where the older than Egypt question becomes subtler and honestly more interesting than the internet version where everyone types in all caps by sentence 3. A careful reading might suggest that even within a dynastic monumental zone, some places can be older than the formal plan built around them. That possibility is not exotic. Human societies do this all the time. They build temples on older shrines. They repurpose hills, springs, caves, and standing stones. They inherit landscapes and then write their own meanings onto them. So one interpretation is that the Giza Plateau, while clearly monumentalized in the Old Kingdom, may have included features or focal points that carried significance before the 4th dynasty turned the area into the grand royal stage we recognise today. That's a possibility, not a certainty. Historians still argue whether there is enough evidence to treat Giza as a site with substantial pre-dynastic sacred continuity in a way that changes how we interpret specific monuments like the Sphinx. Some scholars emphasise continuity of place. Others caution that sacred reuse is easy to imagine and difficult to prove in precise detail. The distinction matters because the phrase older than Egypt can accidentally flatten a very long human timeline in the Nile region. Most historians agree that long before dynastic unification, people lived farmed, buried their dead, and developed regional cultures in northeastern Africa and along the Nile. So if a person says older than Egypt, they may mean older than pharaonic state Egypt, not older than human activity in the region. Let me rephrase that more carefully. the mystery may not be, did humans exist there before the pharaohs? Because yes, of course they did. The debated question is whether the Sphinx itself, or some precursor form of it, could belong to a far earlier phase than the mainstream dynastic dating suggests. As you continue walking in this sleepy mental scene, the plateau starts to feel like layered paper. On top is the famous image the world knows: pyramids, tourism photos, dramatic sunsets, and somebody somewhere insisting they have solved everything with one blurry diagram. Beneath that are dynastic planning decisions, quarry cuts, royal symbolism, and temple alignments. Beneath that, perhaps, are older landforms, earlier pathways, and forgotten meanings. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. Archaeology suggests the Sphinx sits in a geological and architectural setting that ties it strongly to the Giza complex. That is why mainstream Egyptology remains the primary framework, and why most historians agree the burden of proof sits heavily on claims for a much older origin. A fringe idea proposes that dynastic Egyptians discovered an already ancient monument and integrated it into their royal landscape, reshaping or restoring it as needed. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it persists because the idea of inherited sacred architecture fits a pattern seen in other cultures, even if the specific evidence at Giza remains debated. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the what if grows less like a dramatic reveal and more like a dim lantern illuminating a corridor. You picture the fourth dynasty arriving not to an empty stone stage, but to a plateau already marked by memory. Maybe not by a fully carved sphinx, maybe not by anything so recognisable, but by an outcrop, a place, a feature that had drawn attention for generations. A more cautious explanation could be that the outcrop simply became useful and symbolically powerful when Old Kingdom architects designed the complex, and the sense of deeper antiquity comes from the monument's weathering and later restorations rather than an earlier civilization. Both possibilities can exist in your mind tonight without fighting to the death, which is nice, because this is a sleep channel and not an arena. You let the fan hum. You let the stone be stone. You let the timeline breathe. What's broadly accepted is that Giza reaches its monumental peak in dynastic Egypt. One interpretation is that dynasties may have formalised a landscape that held older significance, and the cinematic what if, soft and patient, is this: what if the pharaohs did not invent every sacred focal point here, but inherited at least one of them already, weathered, already watching, and then wrapped it in temples, ritual, and royal meaning until the original chapter became almost impossible to read? That question does not overthrow the evidence. It sits beside it. It asks for patience. It asks for definitions. It asks whether a monument can belong fully to one civilization and still carry traces of a deeper past. Scholars continue to debate where that line should be drawn, and if the evidence is thin, we'll say so when we get there. For now, the plateau remains a place of accepted history first, with a narrow door left open for interpretation and a little moonlit space beyond that where your imagination can walk barefoot and not get in trouble. At least not much trouble. By now, the plateau has begun to feel less like a postcard and more like a workshop frozen mid-thought, and your attention drifts back to the face, because that is where human beings always end up. We can stare at a lion body for a while, yes, but the face is where we start asking identity questions, and identity questions are where sleep-friendly archaeology gets deliciously complicated. Most historians agree that the Great Sphinx was designed within an Egyptian royal context, and that its face is commonly associated with a king, often Khafra, based on the monument's location near his pyramid complex and valley temple. Archaeology suggests the Sphinx fits into a broader tradition of royal imagery in ancient Egypt, where rulers could be represented through idealized forms and powerful symbolic bodies. A lion-bodied guardian linked with royal authority is not an alien concept in this setting. It is very Egyptian, very political, and very on-brand for a civilization that understood visual messaging long before branding consultants started charging by the hour. What's broadly accepted is that the current head appears proportionally small compared with the large lion body, and this disproportion is one reason people keep circling back to the question of whether the head was modified. That is a visible fact of the monument as it stands. The interpretation comes later. One interpretation is that the head may have been recarved from a larger original head, perhaps to restore damage or alter the identity. A more cautious explanation could be that the body and head proportions reflect the shape and quality of the bedrock available, plus the practical limitations of carving into uneven limestone layers. In other words, ancient stoneworkers may have been dealing with geology, not just symbolism and dramatic plot twists. Historians still argue whether the Sphinx's facial proportions and carving style are best explained by original design choices, later recutting, or multiple restoration phases that changed the appearance over time. That exact debate matters because if the head was significantly recut, then the face you see now may not perfectly preserve the monument's earliest form. That's a possibility, not a certainty. Let me rephrase that more carefully. Even if the monument was first carved in dynastic Egypt, later modifications could complicate stylistic comparisons. And if someone argues for an earlier origin, the same possibility may be used to explain why the head looks more Egyptian royal than the body's age theory would suggest. This is where the conversation often slips into confident claims, and tonight we are not doing that. We're not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. The evidence we do have points to repeated repair and restoration in antiquity and modern times. The Sphinx has suffered erosion burial by sand, human intervention, and patching over centuries. So when people debate the face, they are not arguing over a pristine sculpture fresh from the quarry. They are studying an object that has lived a long, rough life and has been helped by many hands, which, as any homeowner knows, can make original features very hard to identify. Still, the face remains a magnet for alternate theories. A fringe idea proposes that the Sphinx originally had a different head, entirely perhaps more lion-like, and that a later Egyptian ruler recarved it into a pharaonic face to claim an older monument. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it persists because it seems to solve two things at once: the small head and the desire for a deeper timeline. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a useful thought experiment. It asks not, did this definitely happen, but would recarving leave the kind of clues people think they see? A careful reading might suggest that recarving is not impossible in principle. Ancient Egyptians repaired or altered and repurposed monuments. They were practical, political, and not sentimental in the modern museum sense. If a monument needed restoring, re-inscribing, or updating for legitimacy, they could do it. But possibility alone does not settle this specific case. Scholars continue to debate whether the visual evidence on the Sphinx's head is strong enough to support major recarving theories, and there's no full consensus beyond the basic reality that the monument has undergone many interventions. As you keep looking, the face begins to feel almost like a worn coin. You can still read the image, but not every line is sharp, and every observer fills in missing details with expectation. Some viewers see Khafra's features, others see uncertainty. Some see damage and weathering, others see intentional redesign. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. And then there is the simple psychological force of scale. The Sphinx face is famous enough that your brain expects certainty from it, as if a monument this iconic should come with a clear label and a neat answer. Instead, the label is smudged, the archives are incomplete, and the stone itself has opinions. That gap between fame and certainty is where theory grows. A popular rumour claims the face hides coded proportions, linking it to lost civilizations or astronomical ages. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it survives because pattern seeking is one of humanity's favourite hobbies right after storytelling, and pretending we will go to bed early. Most historians agree that the strongest case for understanding the face still begins with Egyptian royal art's local context and dynastic monument building. Archaeology suggests style and setting matter more than internet symmetry diagrams. One interpretation is that later recutting or restoration may have altered enough details to keep the identity question open at the edges. And the cinematic what if, quiet and stubborn, is this. What if the face is not a single moment in stone, but a layered portrait shaped across different eras, each one polishing its own authority onto an older body? That possibility does not require you to abandon mainstream history. It asks you to recognise that ancient monuments can be both anchored in a known civilization and modified through time in ways that blur their earliest chapter. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. The wind and dust and patient limestone. The wind and dust and patient limestone. The Sphinx seems less like a statue with one identity and more like a monument that may have worn more than one mask, even if we may never know exactly when each layer was carved, which is honestly a very ancient way to be famous. You keep your eyes on the stone, and sooner or later the conversation arrives where it almost always arrives in this debate. The marks on the enclosure walls and the body itself, those grooves and softened surfaces that make people lean in and ask whether they are looking at ordinary aging in desert conditions or something that hints at a wetter world. This is the part where geology walks into the room, clears its throat, and reminds everyone that rocks tell stories slowly and not always in complete sentences. The evidence we do have points to visible erosion on the Sphinx, and especially within parts of the Sphinx enclosure, where the limestone bedrock shows different patterns of wear. Most historians agree that the monument has endured long exposure burial by sand cycles of excavation and restoration, all of which affect how surfaces weather and how we read them today. Archaeology suggests the stone itself is not uniform. Different layers of limestone vary in hardness, which means some sections erode faster than others, even under similar conditions. That is solid ground, and it matters a lot, because any dramatic theory that ignores rock quality is basically trying to solve a puzzle while throwing away half the pieces. Now comes the debated interpretation that made this topic famous far beyond Egyptology circles. Some researchers and commentators have argued that certain erosion features in the enclosure look more like weathering from prolonged rainfall and runoff than from wind and sand alone. One interpretation is that if heavy rainfall played a major role in shaping those surfaces, then at least part of the carving or exposure phase might belong to a much wetter climatic period than the Old Kingdom. That's a possibility, not a certainty. This is suggestive, not conclusive. Historians still argue whether the erosion patterns around the Sphinx are best explained by ancient rainfall, later water runoff, salt, weathering wind, abrasion, variable stone quality, or some combination of all of these over a very long sequence of exposure and burial. And that last phrase, some combination, is where a lot of the sober discussion lives. Real monuments are messy. They do not weather according to one clean theory just to make our documentaries easier to edit. A more cautious explanation could be that desert environments can still produce complex weathering, especially when occasional rain groundwater effects, salt crystallization, temperature changes and human excavation histories are involved. In other words, desert does not mean never any water, and water marks do not automatically mean Ice Age monument. Let me rephrase that more carefully. Visible erosion may raise important questions, but the leap from erosion pattern to precise monument date is larger than it first appears. Still, the reason this debate persists is understandable. If you stand in the enclosure in your imagination and picture the walls, it is easy to feel that the stone looks worked by more than just drifting sand. The grooves can seem rounded and vertical in ways that invite comparison to runoff. A fringe idea proposes that the Sphinx, or at least the carved enclosure, must be much older than dynastic Egypt, because the strongest rainfall capable of producing such weathering belongs to a prehistoric wet period. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it remains influential in popular discussions because it ties a visible feature to a grand timeline shift, and people love a visible clue they can point at with dramatic music in the background. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the question becomes richer and less brittle. You can ask what kinds of weathering processes are actually documented at Giza. How do geologists distinguish rainfall erosion from other forms? How much surface has been altered by later cleaning, restoration, or excavation? What role does differential limestone quality play? What's broadly accepted is that these are the kinds of technical questions that matter more than slogans, even if slogans fit better on thumbnails. And there is another subtle piece here that often gets lost. The Sphinx has spent long periods buried up to the neck or partly buried in sand across its history. Archaeology suggests repeated burial and re-excavation changed how different surfaces were exposed at different times. Some areas were shielded, others were open, some absorbed moisture differently, some were patched, some cracked. The monument you see is a layered weathering archive, not a clean laboratory sample. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. And in this case, what we can't confirm includes the exact sequence of every erosional episode. Scholars continue to debate the rain erosion argument because it sits at the intersection of geology, archaeology, and chronology, and each field carries its own methods and caution levels. Most historians agree the mainstream dating of the Sphinx to the Old Kingdom remains the dominant interpretation supported by archaeological context and the broader Giza complex. One interpretation is that geological observations may still preserve clues that complicate the story without overturning it. A careful reading might suggest the erosion debate raises valid questions about environmental history and monument exposure, even if it does not by itself prove an earlier civilization. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so, and here the evidence is debated enough that certainty should stay on a short leash. Now the cinematic what if begins to move in the distance, not as a conclusion, but as weather. You picture dark clouds over a much greener northern Africa rain, channels cutting across limestone, and an already carved monument receiving seasons of water long before pharaonic banners ever flap nearby, then you let that image sit beside another one, Old Kingdom builders carving the enclosure and monument in known dynastic time, with later weather runoff and geology creating the patterns that modernise debate. Both scenes are possible to imagine. Only one is mainstream. The other remains an open, contested interpretation. We're not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. So you keep the stone in view and resist the urge to make it testify too neatly. The evidence we do have points to real erosion and real complexity. Historians still argue whether that complexity points to heavy ancient rainfall in a way that changes the monument's date. And while the answer remains unsettled in public imagination, the question itself has become part of the Sphinx's power, a face of stone, a body of lion and walls around it that may be recording not just a monument's age, but a landscape's long memory. Even the wind seems to slow down while you think about that. And once you let weather into the conversation, the horizon widens on its own, because the Sphinx is no longer just a statue in a desert. It becomes a question about whether this place was always a desert, in the way you picture it now, all glare and grit and stubborn wind. Most historians agree that it was not. North Africa has not been locked into one climate forever, and the Sahara itself has shifted dramatically across long spans of prehistory. What's broadly accepted is that there were wetter phases, sometimes called Green Sahara periods, when parts of what are now arid regions held grasslands, lakes, rivers, and far more life than the modern postcard version suggests. Archaeology suggests prehistoric people lived across these landscapes, leaving rock art tools, settlements, and traces of activity in places that look almost impossible to inhabit today unless you are part camel, part meteorologist, and deeply committed to improvisation. The evidence we do have points to climate swings over thousands of years, driven by natural changes in Earth's orbit and monsoon patterns that shifted rainfall northward and then back again. In plain, sleepy terms, the Sahara has had moods, very long moods. That accepted climate history matters because it gives context to the older Sphinx debate without automatically deciding it. One interpretation is that if significant rainfall and greener conditions existed in prehistoric North Africa, then theories linking Sphinx erosion to wetter climates become at least chronologically imaginable. That's a possibility, not a certainty. Let me rephrase that more carefully. A known wet period in the region means earlier rainfall is not a fantasy concept, but it does not by itself date a monument at Giza to that period. You still need evidence connecting the climate history to the carving and exposure of this specific structure. Historians still argue whether the wet phases of the Sahara are relevant to the Sphinx in a direct dating sense, or whether they mainly provide background conditions that enthusiasts sometimes overextend into conclusions. This is one of those debates where both sides can sound persuasive if you only hear one paragraph from each. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We know wetter periods existed. We do not have a neat timestamp stamped into the Sphinx's shoulder saying carved during the thunderstorm season, thanks for asking. Still, the climate story changes the emotional tone of the monument in a useful way. You can stop imagining the Sphinx as born into endless sand and begin imagining a much older landscape cycle around Giza itself, different rainfall patterns, changing vegetation, shifting human movement, and the slow transformation of terrain over millennia. Most historians agree the Nile Valley and nearby regions experienced deep environmental changes long before dynastic Egypt emerged. A careful reading might suggest that any serious discussion of early monument possibilities, however speculative, should include climate history, rather than treating the modern desert as timeless. A fringe idea proposes that the Sphinx was carved in a prehistoric wet era by a culture predating dynastic Egypt, and later inherited by Egyptians who restored and reinterpreted it. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it gains traction in popular imagination because it marries two powerful images, a greener Sahara and a monument that looks weathered beyond easy explanation. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the idea becomes less of a proclamation and more of a lens. It asks what kind of evidence would be needed to make such a claim stronger, and what evidence currently remains missing. And some of that missing evidence is exactly why mainstream chronology remains dominant. Archaeology suggests the Sphinx must be interpreted within the wider Giza complex, where dynastic construction activity is well attested. The evidence we do have points to 4th dynasty, monumental planning, quarrying and temple building in the immediate area. A more cautious explanation could be that environmental history helps explain weathering complexity and geological context, while the carving itself still belongs to the Old Kingdom. That is where most historians still place the monument, and not because they are afraid of mystery, but because context matters. As you walk this out in your imagination, though, the what-if scene becomes irresistible in the gentlest way. You picture the plateau not yet framed by the familiar pyramid skyline, but open to a broader, wetter world. Grass moves in wind where modern sand now drifts. Seasonal water gathers in low places. Distant thunder rolls over stone outcrops. Human groups pass through, maybe hunting, maybe herding, maybe stopping at a strange rock formation that catches the light at sunset. Is there a carved lion face guardian there already? That's where imagination enters. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. What if the stories are pointing at something else? Not necessarily a fully formed sphinx in deep prehistory, but perhaps a landscape feature that mattered long before dynastic architects transformed Giza into royal theatre. One interpretation is that later monumental builders might choose sites already charged with significance, whether practical, symbolic, or sacred. Scholars continue to debate how much continuity we can responsibly infer at Giza, and if the evidence is thin, we'll say so. Here, the continuity of human presence in broader regions is documented. The continuity of meaning at this exact monument remains debated. And this is why Section 5 in your sleepy midnight mind feels like a map unfolding rather than an answer arriving. Climate science does not solve the Sphinx. It changes the list of reasonable questions. It allows the possibility that rain-based interpretations are not instantly absurd, while also reminding you that possible climate is not the same as confirmed monument date. It widens the stage without assigning the actors. So the desert around the Sphinx becomes, for a moment, less permanent and more historical. The sands you imagine tonight are just the latest arrangement. The dry wind is just the current chapter. Most historians agree that landscapes change, cultures adapt, and monuments outlast the stories first told about them. And in that shifting frame, the Sphinx seems to watch not only kings and empires, but climates themselves, as if even the stone is waiting for us to ask the question more carefully, which, to be fair, is a very good skill to practice before sleep and before archaeology. By now, your imagination has given the plateau raingrass and prehistoric possibilities, but the stone itself pulls you back toward a more practical question. One ancient builders would appreciate immediately: how do you actually make this thing? Before theories about forgotten ages can do their dramatic cape swirl, they have to pass through chisels, quarry marks, labour, and engineering choices. And honestly, that is where the story gets even better, because the Sphinx is not just a symbol, it is a carved problem solved in limestone. Archaeology suggests ancient Egyptians were highly skilled stoneworkers who could quarry, shape, transport, and finish immense amounts of stone for pyramids, temples, causeways, and statues. Most historians agree the Giza Plateau itself provided much of the limestone used in construction, and the Sphinx is carved directly from a bedrock outcrop rather than assembled from blocks. What's broadly accepted is that the monument's body and enclosure are intimately tied to quarrying logic at Giza. This is solid ground, and it matters because the Sphinx is literally part sculpture, part geological circumstance. The evidence we do have points to the Sphinx enclosure having been cut into the bedrock with removed stone likely used in nearby construction, including temple elements associated with the complex. That relationship makes practical sense in a dynastic building program. Carve the monument from the native outcrop, extract usable stone, and integrate the result into a larger architectural and ceremonial layout. Efficient, symbolic, and varying character for a state capable of turning a plateau into a royal statement piece. But practical logic can support more than one interpretation, and this is where the conversation opens again. One interpretation is that Old Kingdom builders identified an already prominent natural outcrop and transformed it into the Sphinx as part of their monumental plan. A more cautious explanation could be that there was no mysterious predecessor at all, just smart use of local geology. Another interpretation, more speculative, is that later dynastic engineers may have adapted or reshaped an older carved feature that was already difficult, weathered, or incomplete. That's a possibility, not a certainty. Historians still argue whether the quarry and enclosure evidence is best read as a straightforward Old Kingdom creation process, or whether some features leave room for multiple carving phases, major reworking, or inherited stone forms. Most historians agree the mainstream case favours an Old Kingdom origin because the Sphinx fits the surrounding construction context. A fringe idea proposes that dynastic Egyptians were not the original creators but exceptional restorers who formalised a monument that already existed in rougher form. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it persists because adaptation is a real thing in ancient building practice, and because the Sphinx's irregularities make people wonder what earlier shape may have guided the carving. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the adaptation idea becomes a technical question instead of a dramatic declaration. What traces would a major recutting leave? How do quarry faces, tool marks, and surface treatments help identify phases? How much evidence survives after erosion restoration and modern intervention? The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. And in this case, one of the missing pieces is a complete untouched surface that preserves every carving stage like a time-lapse video in stone. As you imagine workers on the plateau, the scene becomes beautifully ordinary in a way that protects the wonder rather than reducing it. Ropes, stone hammers, copper tools, wooden sledges, measuring cords, shouted instructions, dust in the lungs, sun on shoulders, someone definitely saying, "Who moved my chisel?" Ancient monument building is not less impressive because humans did it. It is more impressive. Archaeology suggests the Egyptians achieved astonishing results through organisation and accumulated craft knowledge, and that mainstream fact should stay at the centre of the story. And still the what if remains useful. What if the outcrop chosen for the Sphinx was not just convenient, but already meaningful? What if its shape or exposure made it a focal point before formal carving began? One interpretation is that the line between natural feature and monument may have unfolded in stages. First, a noticeable outcrop, then local significance, then larger state intervention, then royal carving and temple integration. This is not the same as claiming a lost civilization carved the Sphinx in deep prehistory. It is a gentler possibility about how places become monuments over time. Scholars continue to debate how much staging or reworking is visible in the monument's current form, especially because so much of the surface has weathered or been repaired. The evidence we do have points clearly to ancient Egyptian capability and dynastic context. A careful reading might suggest that capability itself includes the possibility of adaptation, recutting, and practical reuse. Let me rephrase that more carefully, saying Egyptians may have adapted something does not diminish them. If anything, it highlights their ability to see potential in difficult stone and make it part of a coherent sacred landscape. This matters for the bigger question because people sometimes frame the debate as a false choice between Egyptians built it and someone else built it. Reality is often less theatrical and more layered. Most historians agree Egyptians built and monumentalized the Sphinx as we know it. The debated edge is whether they were working from a fresh quarry plan, a partly shaped precursor, or a landscape feature with older significance. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. Here the evidence for Egyptian monumental engineering is strong. The evidence for a much earlier carved predecessor remains disputed and far less secure. And yet the image is hard to shake once it appears, chisels striking stone under a dynastic sun, while beneath each measured cut there lingers the possibility that the workers are not beginning the story from zero, but entering mid-sentence. The cinematic what if is not a replacement for archaeology. It is a mood that asks whether ancient engineers, brilliant as they were, might sometimes have inherited more than raw rock. You let that thought settle like dust in the enclosure. Not proof, not revelation, just a possibility quietly framed while the practical sounds of quarry logic keep humming underneath it like the fan in your room. The dust settles, the quarry logic stays in your mind, and then your attention shifts outward again to the structures beside the Sphinx, because a monument this large does not simply lie in the open and hope people understand it. It gets framed, approached, ritualized, built around. What's broadly accepted is that the Sphinx stands in relationship to temple structures on the Giza plateau, including the Sphinx temple and nearby components connected to the broader Khafra complex. Archaeology suggests these buildings were part of an integrated ceremonial and architectural environment where movement, sightlines and ritual significance mattered as much as stone volume. Most historians agree that these temple structures, built with large limestone and granite blocks, reflect Old Kingdom monumental planning and royal ideology. The evidence we do have points to a sophisticated arrangement rather than a random cluster of sacred buildings. The Sphinx is not merely near temples by accident. It is part of a designed landscape where architecture helps define meaning. In mainstream terms, this supports a dynastic reading. The statue and temples belong to a shared monumental program tied to Egyptian kingship and sacred order. And yet, as usual, the very strength of that framing raises a softer question. One interpretation is that formal temple construction can sometimes represent not the first moment of a site's importance, but the state's decision to organise, claim, and ritualise a place that already carried significance. That possibility is not strange in human history. Cities build cathedrals on older shrines. Empires paved roads to springs. People revered long before official religion arrived with stone facades and accounting systems. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the Sphinx and its temples can be read not only as a creation event, but also as a reframing event. Historians still argue whether the Sphinx temple and surrounding architecture should be interpreted strictly as original components of a single Old Kingdom conception, or whether they might preserve signs of adaptation to an earlier focal feature in the landscape. Most historians agree the mainstream evidence favours integrated Old Kingdom planning. A more cautious explanation could be that even an integrated plan can still include practical responses to pre-existing geology without implying a pre-dynastic carved monument. Let me rephrase that more carefully. The presence of temples beside the Sphinx strongly supports dynastic investment, but it does not automatically settle every question about what phases of shaping may have come before final monumental framing. As you walk through the imagined temple spaces, the stone feels cooler, the corridors more deliberate. You can picture priests moving through processional paths, offerings carried shadows cutting across the floor, at different times of day, ritual language echoing off hard surfaces. Archaeology suggests Egyptian sacred architecture often choreographed experience through alignment thresholds and controlled movement. The Sphinx in this setting becomes less a lonely statue and more a participant in ritual theatre. That is documented enough in the broad sense to stand on solid ground. A fringe idea proposes that the temples were built around an already ancient Sphinx as a way for dynastic rulers to appropriate an inherited sacred object and fold it into royal ideology. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it persists because state appropriation of older sacred sites is historically plausible in many cultures, and because the Sphinx's unusual weathering and unclear early record leave just enough fog for speculation to stroll in, wearing expensive sandals. The evidence we do have points to Old Kingdom construction in the temple architecture, but whether that architecture frames a newly carved statue or a significantly older centerpiece remains debated at the edges. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We can map stones and foundations, we can compare masonry techniques, we can trace relationships across the Giza complex. What we cannot do easily is reconstruct every symbolic decision made by ancient planners, especially if they were themselves layering meaning onto an already resonant place. Scholars continue to debate how much continuity of sacred significance can be inferred from architecture alone, and if the evidence is thin, we'll say so. Here, the evidence for dynastic monumental framing is strong. The evidence for a much older sacred centerpiece is possible to imagine, but difficult to establish firmly. Still, the what if is hard to resist because temple architecture feels like a sentence written around a noun. What if the noun was older than the sentence? What if the priests and architects of the Old Kingdom, brilliant and fully capable, encountered a striking outcrop or partially shaped figure and chose not merely to carve it, but to canonize it, placing courts walls and ritual spaces around it until the monument became inseparable from royal theology? One interpretation is that the temples may preserve the moment. A landscape feature became official state-approved sacred reality. Most historians agree that in the mainstream model, the Sphinx and adjacent temples belong together in the 4th dynasty monumental program. Archaeology suggests the construction relationships and placement support that strongly. A careful reading might suggest that belong together does not necessarily mean began at the exact same moment in exactly the same conceptual way, especially in a living project with quarrying, carving and adaptation happening across time. That's a possibility, not a certainty. By now, you may notice a recurring pattern in tonight's journey, and that is intentional. We are staying close to the evidence while allowing a narrow corridor for interpretation. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. The temples are solid ground. Their dynastic context is solid ground. The possibility that they reframe something older is mist, but it is a shaped mist, not just random fog. And in the cinematic quiet of this section, the image lingers: stone courtyards, lit by low sun priests, crossing between walls and the Sphinx at the centre, not merely carved but ceremonially enclosed, as if ancient Egypt is placing a royal frame around a presence that may already have been there long enough to feel ancient even to them, which would be a very Egyptian thing to do, honestly. If you inherit a mystery, you do not ignore it. You build a temple next to it. By now you have stone weather temples and climate in your hands like piece of a puzzle spread across a table, and naturally your mind reaches for the thing modern people always want when a monument gets complicated paperwork: a plaque, a dedication text, a neat line saying who built it, when and why, ideally, with a signature and maybe a little ancient flourish at the end. Instead, what you find around the Sphinx is something much more human and much more frustrating: a long historical presence with no single simple construction label preserved for us in the way we wish. The evidence we do have includes inscriptions, restoration records, and references to the Sphinx from later periods of Egyptian history, especially when the monument was already old, damaged or partly buried and needed attention. Most historians agree that by the New Kingdom, the Sphinx was a revered and restored monument, clearly significant in Egyptian religious and royal imagination. Archaeology suggests repeated episodes of excavation and maintenance, which tells you the monument mattered across centuries. What's broadly accepted is that later Egyptians knew it cared for it and attached meaning to it. What's not broadly available is a straightforward surviving inscription that says, in modern terms, built in year X by King Y for purpose Z. And this absence creates a vacuum that theories rush to fill. One interpretation is that ordinary record loss, damage, burial, and the selective survival of inscriptions may explain the silence just fine. A more cautious explanation could be that many ancient monuments are imperfectly documented, and the records we crave were never created in the exact form we imagine. That's a possibility, not a certainty, but it is a very normal possibility in archaeology. Historians still argue whether the lack of a clear founding inscription for the Sphinx should be treated as meaningful evidence for an unusual origin, or simply as a frustrating but unsurprising gap in the archaeological record. Most historians agree on the second option. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm, and archival survival is one of the cruelest filters in ancient history. Papyrus decays, stone breaks, blocks are reused, sand buries, politics shifts, priests restore without leaving the kind of note future YouTube audiences would appreciate. History very often is a box of missing receipts. A fringe idea proposes that the lack of an explicit construction record is itself evidence that the Sphinx predates dynastic Egypt and was inherited by later rulers who could restore it but not fully explain it. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it persists because silence can feel suspicious, especially when paired with a monument as famous and visually singular as the Sphinx. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, we can ask better questions. How common is missing documentation for ancient monuments? What kinds of inscriptions do survive at Giza? What do later restoration texts actually say, and what do they not say? Archaeology suggests caution here. Absence of evidence is not automatically evidence of hidden origins. Let me rephrase that more carefully. A missing founding inscription may raise curiosity, but it does not by itself move the monument into a radically different timeline. The evidence we do have points much more strongly to contextual dating from architecture geology and associated structures than to a single missing text. That is why mainstream Egyptology remains stable on this point, even while acknowledging that the record is incomplete. Still, the silence has texture, and in a sleep-friendly story, it deserves to be felt. You imagine scribes writing in chambers nearby lists and offerings and names of officials, while outside the Sphinx sits under drifting sand. Its deeper story perhaps obvious to everyone then, and invisible to us now, or perhaps not. Perhaps the builders and priests knew exactly what it was, and simply left no surviving inscription, because survival is random and history is rude. Both possibilities fit the emotional shape of the evidence, and only one of them is widely accepted. We will keep the solid ground separate from the mist. Most historians agree that later references, including the famous New Kingdom dream stela, placed between the paws by Thutmose IV, show how Egyptian rulers re-engaged with the Sphinx as a sacred and royal symbol. Archaeology suggests this later attention reveals reverence and restoration, not necessarily origin details. One interpretation is that later kings may have reinterpreted a monument whose early history was already partly obscure to them. Another interpretation, more mainstream, is simply that they were participating in standard royal renewal of an older but dynastic monument. Scholars continue to debate how much historical memory was preserved versus reinvented in such acts of restoration. What if the story is pointing at something else, not a conspiracy of silence, but the ordinary silence of time itself? Missing records can make fringe theories sound stronger than they are because the blank space feels dramatic. A popular rumour claims the truth was intentionally hidden, erased, or sealed away. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it thrives because humans dislike ambiguity almost as much as they dislike buffering videos. A careful reading might suggest the quieter explanation is often the better one records. Our patchy monuments change and certainty shrinks the farther back you go. And yet the lack of a neat inscription does keep the Sphinx suspended in a special kind of suspense. It is studied constantly, photographed endlessly, and still strangely undocumented in the exact way casual curiosity wants. That gap between fame and paperwork creates the loud silence of this section. You hear it in the wind crossing the pores. You hear it in later texts that honour the monument, but do not hand you a construction date wrapped in a bow. You hear it in the debates that continue because the archive is partial and the stone is damaged. We're not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. So you file this piece where it belongs. The silence is real. The missing simple record is real. The mainstream explanation for that silence is strong and ordinary. The speculative use of that silence is understandable, but far from conclusive. And the Sphinx, as always, keeps its posture and says nothing, which may be the most persuasive argument for its longevity and the most annoying habit ever developed by a monument. The silence of missing records does something interesting to later history. It creates room for stories. And once a monument survives long enough, people from different languages and eras begin to describe it, rename it, explain it, and occasionally project their own fears, pride, and imagination onto it like a very expensive stone screen. Most historians agree that the Sphinx was known and discussed by later visitors and writers, including Greek and Arab observers in different periods, and that these accounts are valuable for understanding how the monument was seen, described, and interpreted across time. What's broadly accepted is that later testimony can preserve important details about condition, local beliefs, visible damage, and cultural meaning. Archaeology suggests such accounts are useful when handled carefully, especially alongside physical evidence. But they are not the same thing as a construction record, and this distinction matters. One interpretation is that changing stories around the Sphinx reveal more about the people telling them than about the original carving date. That's a possibility, not a certainty, but it is often a helpful starting point when legends begin to pile up like luggage at a delayed airport carousel. As the centuries pass in your imagination, the Sphinx keeps receiving new identities. Greek visitors compare unfamiliar things to familiar myths, which is a very human habit, and honestly, one of our main coping strategies as a species. The name Sphinx itself reflects that layering of interpretation rather than an ancient Egyptian origin label. Most historians agree that classical and later names should not be treated as direct evidence for the monument's earliest purpose. They are part of reception history, not necessarily origin history. That does not make them unimportant. It makes them important in a different way. Historians still argue whether certain medieval and later descriptions preserve traces of local memory that could reach further back than the texts themselves, or whether they mainly reflect the storytelling frameworks of their own eras. Scholars continue to debate how much weight oral tradition and late written accounts should carry in discussions about ancient monument origins. A more cautious explanation could be that later reports are best used to track changing interpretation, visible condition, and cultural symbolism, rather than precise dating claims. The evidence we do have points strongly in that direction. Still, the later stories are fascinating, and tonight they matter because they show how mystery accumulates. A popular rumour claims ancient travellers knew secrets about hidden chambers, lost libraries, or buried passageways under the Sphinx and passed them down in coded form. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it thrives because the monument sits at the perfect crossroads of grandeur and silence. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the more interesting question becomes, why do so many eras feel compelled to tell a new story about the same stone face? Archaeology suggests the physical condition of the Sphinx changed dramatically over time due to sand burial, erosion, and excavation. Some visitors likely saw more of the body, others saw mostly the head emerging from sand. That alone would affect interpretation. Imagine meeting a giant stone head in the desert versus a full lion-bodied figure in an exposed enclosure. Same monument, very different emotional experience. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm, and here one of the unknowns is exactly what each historical observer could actually see at the moment they described it. In Arabic and medieval traditions, as in many cultures, monumental ruins often gather local legends, moral tales, and explanations that blend memory, imagination, and landscape familiarity. Most historians agree these traditions are historically meaningful, even when they are not literal origin accounts. One interpretation is that recurring awe and personification around the Sphinx hint At a continuity of emotional response across civilizations, people stand before it and feel it is older than the story in front of them. That feeling is not proof. This is suggestive, not conclusive, but it helps explain why the older than Egypt idea keeps finding fresh voices in every age. A fringe idea proposes that scattered later traditions preserve faint echoes of a pre-dynastic memory, too ancient to survive in formal inscriptions. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it remains attractive because it turns myth into a possible archive. A careful reading might suggest a more cautious path. Myths may preserve cultural truths, symbolic truths, and occasionally historical fragments, but extracting a precise monument date from them is extremely difficult. Let me rephrase that. More carefully, stories can point us toward questions, but they rarely settle technical chronology on their own. And yet, you can feel why people keep trying. The Sphinx sits at that strange intersection where physical enormity invites historical certainty, while damage and silence create interpretive freedom. So each era gives it a fresh costume. To Greeks, a familiar mythical comparison. To medieval observers, a landmark in a sacred and storied landscape. To modern audiences, a debate machine with cheekbones. Most historians agree that none of these later interpretations replaces archaeological context, but one interpretation is that the layering itself becomes evidence of the monument's unique power, not proof of age, but proof of how strongly it resists being reduced to one answer. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the persistence of legends around the Sphinx tells us less about hidden facts and more about a human response to incomplete evidence? You stand in that thought for a moment, and it softens the argument. Instead of asking which civilization owns the mystery, you watch how civilizations converse with it. Some approach with theology, some with empire, some with measurements, some with rumours, some with camera drones and suspiciously intense background music. We're not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. So you place the Greek names, Arab memories and medieval descriptions in their proper frame. They are not direct proof that the Sphinx is millennia older than Egypt. They are not useless either. They are records of reception, reinterpretation and wonder, and they help explain why the monument's debated origin remains alive. The stone may not speak, but people never stop answering it anyway, which, if you think about it, is one of the oldest rituals on Earth. And once later, travellers and medieval storytellers have done their part. The modern world arrives with newspapers, nationalism, early archaeology, tourism, cinema, television, internet forums, and the truly unstoppable human urge to say, what if there's a secret chamber right under that? The Sphinx does not merely survive into modernity. It becomes a global icon, and icons attract legends the way old stone attracts dust. Most historians agree that many of the most popular modern stories about the Sphinx are exaggerated, simplified, or entirely invented over time. A famous example is the repeated claim that Napoleon's soldiers shot off the Sphinx's nose. This is a popular rumour, but historians generally note depictions and descriptions indicating the nose was already missing before Napoleon's Egyptian campaign. The evidence we do have points to the story being a durable myth, rather than a secure historical fact. It survives because it is tidy, dramatic, and lets everyone blame one recognisable villain with a hat. History loves complexity. Rumours love accessories. Archaeology suggests the Sphinx's visible damage results from a much longer and more complicated history of erosion, human interference, restoration and time. What's broadly accepted is that major damage to exposed ancient monuments often accumulates over centuries from multiple causes. One interpretation is that modern myth-making fills the emotional gaps left by incomplete records and damaged surfaces. That's a possibility, not a certainty, but it fits the pattern you've already seen where evidence is partial, stories become louder. Historians still argue whether some modern fringe claims about hidden chambers or secret archives beneath the Sphinx arise from misunderstood survey data, selective reading, or a sincere attempt to make sense of unusual subsurface features. Scholars continue to debate specific geophysical interpretations in some cases, but most historians agree there is no accepted evidence for a sensational hidden library or a neatly packaged lost truth waiting behind a trapdoor. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. And modern media often turns that uncertainty into certainty for entertainment, because uncertainty does not trend as well. A fringe idea proposes that the Sphinx conceals chambers containing records of a lost civilization, preserved wisdom, or pre-Egyptian history. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it remains one of the monument's most persistent modern legends. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the useful question becomes what kinds of subsurface anomalies are actually found around ancient monuments, and how often do they turn out to be natural cavities, construction voids, later disturbances, or ordinary geological features instead of cinematic revelations. A more cautious explanation could be that the plateau is geologically complex and archaeologically busy, so scans and anomalies are not surprising. Ancient landscapes accumulate voids, fractures, cuttings, and structural variation. Archaeology suggests careful excavation documentation and peer-reviewed interpretation matter more than dramatic headlines. Let me rephrase that more carefully. Anomalies may be interesting, but interesting is not the same as confirmed hidden chamber of world-changing secrets. Still, the modern fascination tells you something important and not just about clickbait. Most historians agree the Sphinx occupies a special place in public imagination because it combines clear visibility with unresolved questions. It is right there. You can see it. You can point to it. You can notice damage and weathering with your own eyes. And yet the chronology and interpretation debates require technical knowledge from archaeology, geology, conservation history, and climate science. That gap creates a perfect stage for oversimplified certainty on one side and dismissive sarcasm on the other. Sleep-friendly history is trying to avoid both. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the modern legends are less about hidden rooms and more about modern discomfort with incomplete answers? You live in an age that expects instant search results, high-resolution scans and explainers in under 90 seconds. The Sphinx responds by offering a face, a body erosion, patterns, missing records, and 1,000 years of reinterpretation. It is basically a stone monument to the phrase, "It's complicated," which may be why so many people immediately try to make it uncomplicated. A popular rumour claims every official excavation avoids the real areas on purpose. This theory isn't widely accepted, and if the evidence is thin, we'll say so. The evidence we do have points instead to a long history of excavation, restoration, conservation debates, and changing methods, not a single coordinated plot. One interpretation is that public mistrust grows when technical uncertainty is communicated poorly. Another is that mystery simply sells better than stratigraphy. Both may be true, and honestly, stratigraphy deserves better marketing. As you imagine the Sphinx through the modern centuries, you can almost watch the layers of media piling up: engravings, photographs, documentaries, glossy magazine spreads, internet thumbnails with red circles, serious research reports, tourist selfies, and somewhere in the middle, a geologist trying to explain runoff patterns while everyone asks about Atlantis. Most historians agree that the strongest approach remains patient and interdisciplinary. Archaeology suggests context matters, geology matters, conservation history matters, and the absence of a dramatic reveal is not failure. It is often just reality. We're not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. So you file the modern myths where they belong. Napoleon and the nose, memorable mostly myth. Secret vaults and hidden archives, compelling stories. Debated claims, no broad consensus. Subsurface anomalies, real possibilities for investigation, not instant proof of lost civilizations. The Sphinx remains powerful, not because every legend is true, but because the monument can survive. Legends absorb them and still leave enough unanswered to keep scholars and dreamers walking around it in circles, which, if we are being fair, is a very efficient way for a statue to stay famous. By this point, you can almost feel the modern instruments arriving on the plateau. Soft beeps replacing some of the old guesses, because if a monument inspires enough rumours, eventually someone brings scanners. And that is one of the quieter, genuinely fascinating shifts in the Sphinx story. Not the leap from mystery to certainty, but the gradual move from looking at the surface to measuring what might lie beneath or around it with more disciplined tools. Archaeology suggests that the Giza plateau has been examined with increasingly sophisticated methods over time, including various forms of survey mapping and geophysical investigation. Most historians agree that modern techniques can reveal subsurface anomalies, structural differences, and landscape features that are not obvious from surface inspection alone. What's broadly accepted is that these tools are valuable, but their results are interpretive. A scan can show an anomaly. It does not arrive with a caption reading "Ancient Archive Definitely." That part still requires analysis, context, and caution. The evidence we do have points to a recurring pattern in geophysical work around major ancient monuments anomalies appear. Some turn out to be natural voids, fractures, changes in bedrock density, or geological irregularities. Some may relate to human activity, such as cuttings, construction features repairs, or later disturbances. One interpretation is that anomalies near the Sphinx deserve careful study because the area has a long and complex human history. A more cautious explanation could be that anomalies are normal in a heavily worked limestone plateau and should not be treated as automatic proof of hidden chambers. That's a possibility, not a certainty, and it is one of the healthiest sentences in archaeology. Historians still argue whether particular reported anomalies near the Sphinx and the surrounding plateau have been overstated in public discussions or understated in popular debunking. Scholars continue to debate the meaning of specific findings when data, quality, method differences and interpretation standards vary. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm, and geophysical data sits right in that middle zone, stronger than rumour, weaker than excavation, and easily distorted once it reaches headlines. A fringe idea proposes that every unexplained subsurface signal near the Sphinx points to hidden structures tied to a lost civilization. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it persists because modern instruments seem to promise objectivity, and people naturally assume machine detected. Something means secret confirmed, if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion. The more honest reading is simpler. Machine data can identify targets for further investigation, but it rarely resolves historical questions on its own. A void is found, what is its shape? Geology. A void is found, what is its shape? Geology. Depth, relation to known structures, and evidence of human modification. If a cavity exists, is it ancient, natural, reused, unfinished, or unrelated to the monument's earliest phase? The evidence we do have points to the need for layered interpretation rather than instant revelation. Let me rephrase that more carefully. Scans may raise the possibility of the hidden features, but they do not by themselves date the Sphinx or prove an alternative origin story. And yet, the what if here is especially powerful because it seems so close to touch. You imagine a scan rendering in dim colours on a screen, shapes emerging under the plateau lines and shadows that look just structured enough to trigger every part of your brain trained by adventure films. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if there are cavities, passages, or cut features that belong not to a lost civilization, but to known phases of quarrying, drainage ritual, construction, or later intervention? One interpretation is that the most surprising discovery might be complexity, not conspiracy. A popular rumour claims that authorities already know exactly what lies beneath the Sphinx and refuse to say. This theory isn't widely accepted, and if the evidence is thin, we'll say so. The evidence we do have points instead to a mix of real surveys, partial data, methodological limits, conservation concerns, and the ordinary pace of archaeological work, which is slower than rumour and less photogenic than speculation. Also, archaeologists sometimes spend years being careful about a trench that the internet solves in 11 minutes with a red arrow and dramatic music. Different workflows. Archaeology suggests conservation concerns also shape what can be done around the Sphinx. It is not a sandbox for endless digging experiments. The monument and its surroundings require protection, and invasive exploration carries risks. Most historians agree that restraint is not the same as secrecy. A careful reading might suggest that some public frustration comes from the tension between curiosity and conservation. You want answers now. The stone wants to survive another 1,000 years. The stone usually wins, and honestly, that seems fair. So in this section, the modern scan becomes a kind of mirror. It reflects both the power and the limits of current methods. It can map density contrasts. It can flag anomalies. It can sharpen questions. It cannot substitute for context. It cannot magically separate documented, interpreted, and imagined layers without human judgment. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. We're not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. And the clue here is a good one. The plateau may still contain surprises, but surprises are not automatically sensational. The strongest modern tools do not eliminate mystery, they refine it. They help scholars ask better questions about structure geology and human activity around the Sphinx. Whether any anomaly someday changes how we frame the monument's history remains open. Historians still argue whether current data points to anything extraordinary. For now, the readings flicker, the stone remains patient, and the old face above ground keeps doing what it always does, giving just enough to keep you looking. The instruments fade back into the background, and a deeper problem comes into focus, one that sits right underneath nearly every argument you've heard so far. Even if everyone calms down, speaks politely, and agrees to use careful verbs, there is still the basic issue of dating the Sphinx itself. Not the legends, not the surrounding myths, not the modern documentaries, but the carved limestone monument. And this is where the conversation becomes humbling, because the Sphinx does not come with an easy birthday in the scientific sense people often imagine. Most historians agree that directly dating a carved limestone monument is difficult. Archaeology suggests dating is often done through context-associated structures, construction relationships, tool marks, inscriptions, repair materials, stratigraphy, and the broader archaeological landscape. What's broadly accepted is that you can often date the world around a monument more securely than the exact moment the first chisel struck the coarse stone. The evidence we do have points to strong contextual ties between the Sphinx and the Old Kingdom Giza complex, which is why mainstream dating remains centred there. One interpretation is that contextual dating, while powerful, can still leave room for debate about phases of carving, recutting, and restoration. That's a possibility, not a certainty. A more cautious explanation could be that this room for debate is often much smaller than popular presentations make it seem. Let me rephrase that more carefully. The inability to directly carbon date the Sphinx does not mean we know nothing. It means we rely on indirect methods that can be robust in some areas and less precise in others. Historians still argue whether the strongest dating evidence for the Sphinx should be considered sufficient to settle the monument's origin within the 4th dynasty beyond reasonable doubt, or whether unresolved geological and morphological questions leave a meaningful opening for alternative timelines. Most historians agree the contextual case is strong. Scholars continue to debate some details, especially about erosion, restoration phases, and how much the present form preserves the original surface. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. And what we can't confirm here is the exact date of initial carving stamped into the rock itself. This is where the public conversation often gets tangled. A popular rumour claims that because the Sphinx cannot be directly dated like organic material, any age estimate is basically guesswork. This theory isn't widely accepted. Archaeology suggests that indirect does not mean random. Ancient chronology is often built from converging lines of evidence, and those lines can be quite strong even without a single laboratory number attached to the monument's nose. If we treat uncertainty as a spectrum rather than a void, the picture becomes much more usable. At the same time, uncertainty does create real interpretive space. The evidence we do have may date repairs, restorations surrounding constructions, and later interventions more clearly than the original carving event. One interpretation is that this difference matters more than casual discussions admit. A stone block added in a repair can be dated within a historical context, but that tells you when the repair happened, not necessarily when the original form was first created. A careful reading might suggest the Sphinx is best thought of as a time-layered object: initial carving, erosion, burial, restoration, patching, excavation, and conservation, all stacked into one monumental body. A fringe idea proposes that mainstream dating relies too heavily on the surrounding complex and ignores the possibility that the Sphinx predates it by millennia. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it persists because contextual dating can feel less emotionally satisfying than a single test result. People love certainty with a number attached. The Sphinx offers relationships instead of receipts. It gives archaeology a network problem, not a birthday party. Most historians agree that the strongest mainstream approach combines the Sphinx's placement-associated temples, quarrying relationships, and Old Kingdom monumental context. Archaeology suggests these connections are not incidental. One interpretation is that even within that framework, some aspects of the monument's weathering and form may preserve clues to multiple phases. That possibility does not automatically produce a prehistoric date, but it does encourage careful interdisciplinary debate. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. The evidence for a precise prehistoric carving date remains thin and contested. The evidence for strong Old Kingdom integration is much thicker. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the Sphinx resists dating, not because it belongs to a lost civilization, but because carved bedrock monuments are inherently difficult to reduce to a single timestamp after thousands of years of exposure and repair? That possibility may sound less dramatic, but it is oddly more mysterious in a grown-up way. It means the stone keeps its dignity. It means history must work through clues, relationships and probabilities rather than declarations. And here, in the soft hum of your room that actually fits the mood of the monument, you imagine conservators examining patches, geologists reading layers of limestone, archaeologists tracing construction sequences, historians comparing records from later restorations, everyone working around the same giant body, each discipline holding a flashlight over one part of the puzzle. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. We're not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. So the dating problem becomes less a dead end and more a framework. It tells you why debates persist without forcing you into extremes. It explains why mainstream chronology can remain strong while specific questions stay open. It clarifies why repair dates are not birth dates and why the absence of a neat measurement does not erase context. And as the Sphinx waits in its enclosure older than any one argument about it, you begin to understand that part of its power comes from this exact tension, a monument embedded in history, yet not fully pinned to one easy date by the methods people wish it would obey. Honestly, it is almost like the stone understands public discourse and has chosen to be difficult on purpose. By now, you have enough pieces on the table to see the shape of the argument itself. And this is the moment where the room usually splits into camps. On one side, mainstream Egyptology grounded in archaeological context, dynastic chronology, and the broader Giza building program. On the other, alternative timelines, often drawing on erosion debates, occasional astronomical interpretations, and the sense that the Sphinx feels older than the official story allows. Most historians agree the strongest overall case still places the Sphinx within dynastic Egypt, usually the Old Kingdom. That remains the central anchor. Archaeology suggests this mainstream position is not based on one fragile point, but on a network of relationships, the monument's placement, the Sphinx enclosure, nearby temples, quarrying logic, and the Fourth Dynasty monumental landscape. What's broadly accepted is that Giza as a royal complex belongs to a specific period of Egyptian state power, and the Sphinx fits that context strongly. The evidence we do have points to coherence, not randomness. In other words, mainstream chronology is not simply because tradition says so. It is a structured interpretation built from multiple lines of evidence. And yet, one interpretation is that the mainstream model may still leave unresolved questions, especially about erosion patterns, carving phases, and how much later a restoration has altered what we see. That's a possibility, not a certainty. Historians still argue whether those unresolved questions are small details within a settled timeline or signs of a deeper chronological problem. Most historians agree on the first reading, alternative theorists often favour the second. A fringe idea proposes that the Sphinx predates dynastic Egypt by many thousands of years and was later incorporated into the Giza complex. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it often draws strength from two recurring themes: geological weathering arguments and astronomical speculation. The geological side, you already know, claims that certain erosion features may reflect heavy rainfall from a wetter prehistoric period. The astronomical side usually suggests alignments or symbolic correspondences to celestial ages constellations or long cycle sky patterns, especially in discussions of lion imagery and the age of Leo. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, these ideas become interpretive frameworks rather than declarations. A careful reading might suggest the geology-based questions deserve serious examination because they engage with real physical features. A more cautious explanation could be that astronomical arguments are often more flexible and therefore easier to fit to a preferred theory after the fact. Let me rephrase that more carefully. Astronomy can be historically meaningful in ancient cultures, but broad celestial symbolism does not automatically function as a precise construction date. Scholars continue to debate how much weight astronomical interpretations should carry in specific monument dating arguments, and there's no full consensus beyond the general need for caution. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We can confirm ancient Egyptians cared deeply about the sky. We can confirm Giza was built with extraordinary symbolic and architectural intentionality. We cannot easily confirm that a proposed astronomical correlation uniquely identifies a prehistoric carving date for the Sphinx. Likewise, we can observe erosion and debate mechanisms, but we cannot simply leap from debated weathering pattern to lost civilization confirmed without crossing a lot of thin ice. Most historians agree that alternative theories often become stronger in public imagination when they correctly identify one real ambiguity and then overextend it into a total rewrite. That pattern does not mean every alternative question is worthless. Archaeology suggests fringe and mainstream debates can sometimes sharpen research by forcing clearer definitions, better methods, and more careful language. One interpretation is that the enduring Sphinx debate persists partly because the mainstream model is strong, but not emotionally satisfying to everyone, while the alternative model is emotionally satisfying, but evidentially weaker. That is not an insult to curiosity. It is a description of how humans weigh stories. A popular rumour claims mainstream scholars refuse to consider any evidence that could support an earlier Sphinx. This theory isn't widely accepted, and if the evidence is thin, we'll say so. The evidence we do have points instead to active debate over geology, conservation chronology, and method, with the main disagreement being not whether questions can be asked, but what standards of evidence are needed to overturn a well-supported contextual date. That's a possibility, not a certainty applies here too, just in reverse. Alternative proposals may raise possibilities. They do not automatically clear the evidentiary threshold for conclusion. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if mainstream Egyptology and alternative theorists are in different ways protecting different parts of the same puzzle? Mainstream scholarship protects context, method, and proportionality. Alternative approaches at their best protect the instinct that visible anomalies and unresolved details deserve attention. At their worst, they overclaim. At mainstream scholarship's worst moments, communication can become dismissive. In the calm version of this story, you can admit both things without collapsing the distinction between evidence and speculation. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. The documented part is that the Sphinx sits within a dynastic Egyptian monumental complex. The interpreted part is how to weigh erosion, recutting, and subsurface hints. The imagined part is the cinematic what-if of a much older monument inheriting new meaning under pharaonic hands. We're not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. And perhaps the fairest place to stand, under the slow stars and the old limestone face, is exactly there. Not in certainty theatre, not in total dismissal, but in disciplined wonder. Most historians agree the mainstream date remains the best supported explanation. This theory isn't widely accepted, but some still argue for a much earlier origin based on erosion and astronomy. Historians still argue whether those clues point to a true chronological problem or to the normal complexity of a famous damaged repeatedly restored monument. Either way, the Sphinx keeps its composure while everyone else debates the timeline. A very effective strategy if you can pull it off. And once you have listened to both the mainstream case and the alternative timelines, the next question becomes less. Which side wins tonight and more? Why does this debate refuse to go away? Because by now you can see something important. The Sphinx is not just old stone in a trench. It is damaged, restored, iconic, and symbolically overloaded all at once. That combination is almost custom built to generate arguments that never quite end. Most historians agree that the Sphinx has endured extraordinary physical and interpretive stress across its long life: erosion, sand burial, excavation, restoration, environmental exposure, tourism, pressure, political symbolism, and modern media attention. Archaeology suggests this layered history complicates nearly every attempt to read the monument cleanly. The evidence we do have points to a structure that has changed in appearance over time, not a pristine artifact frozen in its original condition. That matters because debates become harder to settle when the object itself is a palimpsest. One interpretation is that the Sphinx debate persists because people are not only arguing about data, they are arguing about what kind of evidence feels persuasive. Some trust contextual archaeology most. Others are moved by visible erosion patterns. Others still are drawn to the monument's emotional age, the sense that it seems older than the standard narrative. That's a possibility, not a certainty, but it helps explain why the same facts produce different convictions. Historians still argue whether the central disagreement is really chronological, methodological, or psychological. In practice, it may be all three. What's broadly accepted is that damaged monuments invite projection. Missing surfaces, broken features, and incomplete records create open space where interpretation expands. The Sphinx has all of that plus scale and fame. A more cautious explanation could be that many debates around it survive, not because the evidence is uniquely chaotic, but because the monument is globally famous enough that every ambiguity gets amplified. Let me rephrase that more carefully. If a lesser-known limestone statue had similar weathering and documentation gaps, specialists might still debate it, but the internet would not build a mythology industry around it. A fringe idea proposes that the persistence of debate itself is evidence that mainstream chronology is fundamentally wrong and being quietly protected. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it persists because unresolved questions can feel like suppressed answers. The evidence we do have points to something less dramatic and more ordinary, difficult evidence overlapping disciplines. changing methods, and a monument that has been altered by time and conservation. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the continued debate may signal not hidden certainty, but durable ambiguity. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. You know there were restorations. You know there was repeated burial by sand. You know surface conditions changed. You know public narratives have evolved. What you cannot fully reconstruct is the monument's original appearance in one untouched moment, nor every intervention that reshaped how later generations perceived it. Archaeology suggests that kind of incompleteness is normal, but the Sphinx makes it feel personal because the face seems to look back while you argue. Scholars continue to debate how much restoration history has affected current interpretations of erosion and form. Most historians agree conservation is necessary, yet every repair layer can complicate future readings of original surfaces. One interpretation is that the Sphinx's very survival depends on interventions that also blur the earliest evidence. That tension is not a scandal, it is the conservation paradox. Save the monument, and you may alter how later people read its first state. Leave it untouched, and you may lose it faster. Ancient stone is patient, but not invincible. And then there is symbolism, which may be the most powerful accelerant in the whole debate. Most historians agree the Sphinx has become more than an archaeological object. It is a cultural emblem of mystery itself. That means people approach it carrying expectations, treasure hidden wisdom, lost aged royal propaganda, climate clues, spiritual energy, geological puzzles, and occasionally all of these before breakfast. A careful reading might suggest the debate persists because the Sphinx serves too many narrative functions at once. It is a monument, a national symbol, a tourism icon, a scholarly puzzle, and a global myth engine. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the reason the Sphinx debate survives is not that one side is secretly right, but that the monument sits exactly at the boundary where evidence and imagination naturally meet? Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. In this case, the mist is not failure. It is part of why people return. To ongoing efforts to preserve a monument, to ongoing efforts to preserve a monument under real environmental and structural pressures. One interpretation is that public mistrust sometimes grows when conservation work is visible, but technical explanations are not widely understood. Another is that mystery stories simply travel farther than conservation reports. Again, both may be true, and conservation reports deserve better thumbnails. We're not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. So the persistence of the debate becomes a clue in itself, not to a hidden chamber or a lost archive, but to the Sphinx's peculiar status as a damaged giant at the crossroads of science, symbolism and story. Most historians agree the monument remains one of the most studied in Egypt, yet study does not erase ambiguity. Historians still argue whether the unresolved edges are minor or meaningful. And as the plateau cools under the night sky, the Sphinx seems to keep doing the one thing that guarantees immortality in the human imagination. It gives you enough evidence to respect it and enough uncertainty to come back. Honestly, that is a very sophisticated publicity strategy for something carved in limestone. And after all of that, the weathered stone, the dynastic temples, the missing paperwork, the climate shifts, the recutting questions, the modern scans, the debates that refuse to retire. You arrive at the quiet threshold where the story becomes less about winning an argument and more about how to live with a monument honestly. What's broadly accepted is that the Great Sphinx remains one of Egypt's most studied and most symbolically powerful monuments, deeply embedded in the history of ancient Egyptian civilization and the Giza Plateau. That is your solid ground, and it is enough to stand on. Most historians agree that the strongest evidence still places the Sphinx within the dynastic Egyptian world, most often the Old Kingdom context, connected to the broader Giza complex. Archaeology suggests the monument's setting, associated temples, quarry relationships, and royal landscape support that reading strongly. The evidence we do have points to a masterpiece of Egyptian monumental planning, labour symbolism, and endurance. If someone asks for the best supported answer, that is still the answer. And yet, if we treat older age theories as possibilities rather than conclusions, the clues remain fascinating. One interpretation is that the Sphinx debate persists because the monument carries visible complexity, erosion patterns, restoration layers, damaged surfaces, and a face that seems to invite identity questions. Another interpretation is that the debate survives because human beings are drawn to thresholds not fully known, not fully unknown, just enough evidence to keep the door open. That's a possibility, not a certainty, but it feels right in the hush of this final walk. Historians still argue whether the unresolved details around erosion, carving phases, and restoration history are small enough to remain inside a settled mainstream chronology, or significant enough to justify more radical rethinking. Scholars continue to debate, and that is not a flaw in history. It is history doing its job. A more cautious explanation could be that the Sphinx is neither a solved riddle nor an unsolved fantasy, but a monument whose core story is broadly known while its edges remain debated. Let me rephrase that more carefully. The biggest mystery may not be who built it so much as how much of its earliest chapter can still be recovered from the version that survived. A fringed idea proposes that the Sphinx is millennia older than Egypt itself, in the dynastic sense, and preserves a forgotten prehistoric legacy later absorbed by pharaonic builders. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it continues to attract attention because it turns every scar on the stone into a possible clue. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. The evidence for a securely demonstrated prehistoric carving date remains thin and contested. But the questions that theory raises about weathering landscape continuity and how monuments are reused can still be worth exploring when handled carefully. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the deepest lesson of the Sphinx is not a hidden timeline, but a way of thinking, hold the evidence firmly, hold interpretations lightly, and let imagination illuminate without pretending to certify? Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. That has been the real method tonight, and maybe the kindest one. We're not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. So you end where the Sphinx always seems to place you, between certainty and wonder. You can honour the mainstream historical framework without flattening every open question. You can enjoy the what if without promoting it as fact. You can admit that the monument may be exactly what most historians say it is, and still feel the strange pull of a face and body that seem to hold more time than any single explanation can comfortably contain. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. And now as the wind grows softer in your mind, the plateau begins to lose its sharp edges. The stones cool. The arguments fade into distance. The big lion body settles into shadow, and the face becomes less a puzzle to solve and more a shape keeping watch over a long human habit, asking questions of things older than ourselves. You don't need a final verdict tonight. You only need the rhythm of the clues, the calm separation between solid ground and mist, and the quiet comfort of knowing that history can remain meaningful even when some edges stay blurred. So let the pyramids dim at the edge of your imagination. Let the sand flatten. Let the old limestone breathe out the heat of the day. Let the Sphinx keep its silence without demanding one last answer from you. In the slow hush of this final moment, you picture the monument not as a battlefield of theories, but as a patient threshold, Egyptian ancient, debated, beloved, weathered, and still somehow larger than the words stacked around it. And as your thoughts loosen, the questions can loosen too. Maybe it is older than some people think. Maybe it is exactly where mainstream history places it. Maybe the truth is less dramatic than rumour and more interesting than certainty. Either way, the night is gentle, the stone is still, and you can rest beside the mystery without solving it. Let the wind pass over the pause. Let the stars hang where they are. Let the unfinished questions become soft at the edges. And if the Sphinx keeps one last secret, it can keep it until morning.